Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn once said, "We have ceased to see the purpose. We have allowed our wants to grow unchecked and are now at a loss where to direct them. And with the obliging assistance of commercial enterprises, newer and yet newer wants are concocted, and we chase after them in mass, but find no fulfillment, and we never shall. The endless accumulation of possessions that will not bring fulfillment either. As creature comforts continue to improve for the average person, so spiritual development grows stagnant. Comfort brings with it a nagging sadness of the heart, as we sense that the whirlpool of pleasures does not bring satisfaction, and that before long it may suffocate us all. All hope cannot be pinned on science, technology, or economic growth. The victory of technological civilization has also instilled in us a spiritual insecurity. Its gifts enrich but enslave us as well. An inner voice tells us that we have lost something pure, elevated, and fragile. We have ceased to see the purpose. Let us admit it, even if in a whisper, and only to ourselves in the hustle of life at breakneck speed. What are we living for?" Every week there's a new documentary about how bad doom scrolling is, or how AI is going to ruin the future, and how we need to ban AI from all jobs, or how AI is going to improve every job, or how everybody's plagiarizing their college essays. That one hits too close to home. But each of these problems are viewed in vacuums. However, we are slowly inching toward what C.S. Lewis called the abolition of man, where every human function, every moral purpose, every ounce of agency we once had is delegated, either to systems, machines, or an increasingly powerful few that control our lives for us. As we gain control over the natural world and create machines that can do our human tasks supposedly better than we can, then man's conquest of nature turns out, in the moment of its consummation, to be nature's conquest of man. C.S. Lewis explains the moment this happens. Rather than human beings, we increasingly become the subjects of the powerful few who control our algorithms, political systems, but also subject to our base appetites, where instead of having relationships, we all shrink into porn to satisfy our urges, or social media, and no one's actually interacting with anybody else. But all of our base desires and appetites are being fed, even though we lose what makes us human: our agency, our connectedness, our purpose. Think about a heroin addict on the street who has almost no semblance of an idea of who he is or who anyone else is, but just has a somewhat pleasurable experience mediated by terrible pain. He's not having the human experience. He's given up what makes us what we are and has become closer to the animal. It's a shame we speak so much about 1984, George Orwell's dystopian novel, where he develops his fear of a totalitarian state coming in and forcing control upon the rest of us, and less upon his predecessor, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, that envisaged a world where people are so satiated by soma, by someone taking care of their every desire, that they welcome the tyrants in. Everything became about pleasure. It was virtually illegal to say no to anyone who wanted to have sex with anybody else, because you would be denying them pleasure. Well, in doing that, you would also deny yourself any sense to autonomy, dignity, or discernment. And we've never been closer to a brave new world than we are today. We forget, for centuries, science was useless. Jean-Jacques Rousseau pointed this out. He said, "What would it matter if we never found out that there's an invisible force that makes apples fall to the ground called gravity, or the larval stage of a beetle? Because for practical purposes, modern science did virtually nothing. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution and advances in medicine and building rocket ships centuries later that we were able to apply all of this theoretical knowledge we'd been developing for centuries for its own sake. In the same way, I think we're about to hit that same moment for philosophy. Philosophy's been a punchline for unemployed college students. In fact, I used to say that in college I was going to major in philosophy so I could be unemployed and minor in econ so I'd know why. But I think this might be the turning point for philosophy, where just like science, it can now actually become an integral part of practical life. Information, on the other hand, has taken a reverse course. Information used to be very practical and related to a specific problem someone was trying to solve. The information the average peasant would have would be related to their family and their community and the god they worshipped and the marketplace they sold lima beans in. Scholastics would be concentrated on studying God, It wasn't really until the movement known as humanism, which preceded the Renaissance, where the educated began taking an interest in what they viewed as all of God's creation, including literature and art and music for the first time. No one really gave up about those as we understand them today, before the humanists. They broke with the scholastic tradition by emphasizing the imago Dei, or the idea that humans were made in God's image, rather than the traditional notion that emphasized the fall of man and Adam's disobedience against God. By sort of rediscovering in the popular imagination that humans were made in God's image, they re-began an interest in literature and rhetoric and a focus on art and music. Part of that was revival from the ancient Romans and Greeks, but part of it was the first time we actually cared about those things. That's the beginning of information being a good in and of itself. But before the Industrial Revolution, information was inherently scarce, and now we are surfeited with it. We have too much. We cannot make sense or find a purpose in just the onslaught of information we get every day. Imagine you're given 5 clues about an incident that happened. You'd be able to piece it together pretty well. Say, a man cheats on his wife, the wife is found dead, the man is convicted and goes to jail. But if you were told 100,000 miscellaneous details that don't necessarily pertain to the real core of the story, the information will be in there, but so much else will be too that you'll never get to what really happened. You hear the temperature was 63 degrees, the floor was parquet wood, the man was born in 1822. Think about how everything a sculptor does is just remove. He takes out irrelevant pieces of stone that he doesn't want in his creation. Well, we are now living in a world of pre-carved stone, and philosophy is our tool to actually sculpt the raw material into something discernible, into something useful, into something distinct. Why are we all watching YouTube in 2 times speed? We just have a never-ending hunger for more information, not because it's all useful, but because we were built for an information scarcity world, where every piece of information that you came across would necessarily be likely relevant, because otherwise, why would it get to you? A really important clue to understand what's happened to our relationship with information that's caused us to cease to see the purpose was explained by Neil Postman in his seminal work, Amusing Ourselves to Death. Building off the work of Marshall McLuhan, he explains that the medium is the message. What is he talking about? He's talking about that the medium, or plural media, we use to imbibe information is more important than the information itself. It's the real message. Postman explains that in the 1700s, when the only medium available to anybody was the printed word, reading, the printing press had only been invented a couple centuries earlier, and there was a very strong Protestant cultural emphasis on literacy, because Protestants largely believed that each man could be his own priest and have a personal relationship with God, mediated by God's word in the Bible. Not only would staggering numbers of people read, but everybody would speak in a very literary way. Postman points to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where ordinary citizens would come and listen to Lincoln and Douglas give 1-hour opening statements, each followed by 30-minute rebuttals. Sometimes the debate would last 5 hours, and they would stop for dinner in between. Postman talks about how all their statements read like essay sentences, because the only media people would consume all day would be the written word. Here's Lincoln's opening sentence. "Ladies and gentlemen, it will be very difficult for an audience so large as this to hear distinctly what a speaker says, and consequently, it is important that as profound silence be preserved as possible." Flash forward to the 1980 presidential debate, here's Jimmy Carter's opening debate line. "Mr. Stone, I've had to make thousands of decisions since I've been president serving in the Oval Office, and with each one of those decisions that affect the future of our country, I have learned in the process." Okay, not bad. We're getting a bit away from the literary precision that Lincoln espoused, and then here's Kamala Harris's from 2024. "So I was raised as a middle-class kid, and I am actually the only person on this stage who has a plan that is about lifting up the middle class and working people of America." Okay, it's become much more informal, at least to put it charitably, and of course Trump would speak in similar non-literary styles. Postman argues that the written word emphasizes rationality, logic, analysis, exposition, coherence, because it's prepositions, it's direct points and arguments and ideas. Every other medium, most notably television, very notably TikTok, has other considerations such as style and speed and how handsome your video essay host is. He points to a bunch of studies that demonstrate the same information given in the written word is retained far better than seeing it on television. Postman very strikingly contends it is no accident that what's called the Age of Reason, shortly after the Enlightenment, was coexistent with the dominance of a print-based culture. Here's Postman.
The television is not a suitable medium for the communication of serious ideas. After all, an idea is sentences, language. And television is not terribly comfortable with language. Its strong suit is the visual image. So that when television does news, when it tries to do what Americans now call political debates, this cannot be taken seriously by an informed public. I mean, what is a debate? Someone like Barbara Walters says, first question for you, Mr. President, is what do you think is the solution to the problem in the Middle East? You will have 2 minutes to answer, after which Vice President Mondale will have 60 seconds for rebuttal. Now, who can take that seriously? Newscaster, as he's called, says more shooting in Beirut today. Then we see some film of a street, perhaps in Beirut, a body on the floor. We hear shots. Maybe see a woman leaning over the body. This image is powerful. So people know of Beirut. They know there's shooting in Beirut. Do they know who's shooting at whom, or why, or what is the historical context for this?
But not everyone agrees with him on the virtue of the written word. Socrates famously critiqued writing. Literally just writing. But I think he's right. So he argued that relying on writing would disconnect thinking from doing. And he was completely right.
Every night people tune in and they get all sorts of information with which they can do nothing. And I think this tends to create a certain sense of impotence in people, to be hearing about all of these things, but not being able to act in any way on this information, I think is a terrible burden and a kind of psychological stress. After all, the whole idea of information is to use it in order to act on the world.
Socrates, Buddha, Mohammed, Jesus, Confucius, Zoroaster, Homer, none of these people wrote anything down. They lived by that Marcus Aurelius line and wasted no time arguing about what a good man should be. They were one. Only in the modern world do we have this idea that, like, people who are into poetry or history or philosophy are nerds. Like, that's unthinkable in the pre-modern era, where people's wisdom used to be what they knew and did, and those two things were fundamentally intertwined. Marshall McLuhan talks about an African tribe where, when there were disputes between two villagers, the villagers would go to their version of a court where a judge would look at one of them. I'm not even kidding. Think of an aphorism that best applies to the situation and resolve it that way. So someone will be like, this guy stole my car. And the judge will be like, well, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. And the villagers will be like, you know what, you're right. Here's your car back. Of course, I'm making fun of it a little bit, but that's really how they would do it. Marshall says, imagine if we did that in the first world, where some guy murders your Uncle Billy, and the bailiff asks the jury if they've reached a decision, and the jury comes back and says, to err is human, to forgive is divine. But Billy's dead! Poor Billy. Also, in the Bible, the wise King Solomon was said to know 3,000 proverbs. And think of the second commandment, thou shalt not make graven images, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above. That's very interesting. Of the 10 commandments God gives to Moses, the very second one is about how he should symbolize and represent his experience the right way, about the medium, the media he uses to do it. Postman points out it is only strange when we've assumed that there isn't a connection between forms of human communication and the quality of a culture. Even God knows the medium is the message, because God knew how you represented things, the media you used to think about it, shaped your thinking, and how a culture thought shaped if that was a good culture or not. In the Bible, God is an abstract, universal deity, and therefore if the Israelites made a habit of drawing concrete pictures or statues of him, they would misunderstand his nature, where they might worship him the way they might worship Zeus, who is a being in the world. Zeus is sort of just like a superhuman, whereas the God of the Bible is far from that. Postman explains the God of the Jews, reaffirmed by Jesus in the Gospel of John, was to exist in the Word and through the Word, an unprecedented conception of God, requiring the highest order of abstract thinking. And of course, it's famously punishable by death to make any images of Mohammed in Islam today. The medium is the message. Lewis Mumford, in his book Techniques and Civilization, demonstrates how when the clock became a major part of daily life in the 14th century, we started thinking in mechanical clock-like terms. The authority of nature had been in the sun and the seasons, but it was superseded by human-constructed seconds and minutes, punching in and punching out. Eternity ceased to serve as the measure and focus of human events, but rather, 5 o'clock happy hour took its place. Postman asserts that replacing God's nature as the arbiter of how we lived our days with man-made mechanical time did more to weaken the supremacy of God in human culture than all the treatises produced by the philosophers of the Enlightenment together. Rather, it may have been what even caused the Enlightenment. Additionally, it's no coincidence that once the microscope was invented and we started realizing there were all these little beings and forces inside of us, we started thinking about this concept and then applied it to the mind. And psychoanalysis, with its unseen secret forces and personalities of the mind, were then shortly later uncovered by Freud. Eyeglasses in the 12th century were the first time human beings really encountered the idea that we can improve ourselves and our abilities. Postman connects the invention of the eyeglasses in the 12th century to the splitting of human genes in the 20th. What's important to note is that even in a modern word-based culture like America that's far from Socrates' pre-writing culture that was focused on memory, at some level we know Socrates is right because we believe that speech, the living word, has more of a handle on truth than writing does. Think about it. In the modern courtroom, people give oral testimony rather than just written affidavits. The witness goes up and testifies before the jurors who aren't allowed to write anything down, take notes. In our print-based culture, the memorization of a poem or a law or most anything else is usually deemed as merely charming. It is almost always functionally irrelevant. But when it comes to when we're really deciding on the truth, we know that there's something about actual human speech that is more conducive to leading to truth than writing things down. Memorization used to be a moral category, and not remembering an important poem or a guest's name was seen as a failure of virtue. Someone commented on the Philosophy of Kids TV Part 2 video saying something like, I resonate with this, it makes sense, but people say it's not that deep. And I think that doesn't even make sense. Like, how can there be things in shows that aren't that, like, it's clearly giving you a message. You can say the message is wrong, but of course it's that deep. I think this could only occur in our post-written word culture, where television has taught us to be more passive and less engaged with what we're doing, with the propositions that are put before us. Whereas in the print-based culture, everyone would constantly be looking at ideas and propositions and analyzing them. Television and TikTok is a much more passive medium, which also emphasizes the points I made in those two videos. All those messages in kids TV that we talked about are being beamed into your mind without you even thinking about it or realizing it or thinking it's that deep. I saw Hank Green once say that what advertisers most want you to believe is that you're getting the good deal out of free platforms that are based on advertising, because advertising doesn't really affect you. So you just passively sit back and allow the messages to go into your mind. And that's what advertisers most want you to think. The people who say it's not that deep, I think it's the same thing as when someone takes a political position and says, well, let's not make this political. Like, whatever it is, like, say you want higher taxes, then you'll just say, well, I just believe that the rich should pay their fair share and that people shouldn't be starving on the street. It's not about politics, it's basic human decency. Or you could say the reverse. Well, I just think people should keep what they earn and shouldn't be stolen from them. This is not about politics, it's just human decency. But politics is the way that people decide between those conflicting motivations. And by rhetorically circumventing politics and claiming the moral high ground and being above the dirty business of politics, which is just people actually deciding how society should run, you're able to sneak a conclusion past the conversational conscious line. That's what television does. People think it's not that deep because they're not actively being given a proposition to consider. And therefore, whatever television says is just taken for granted rather than considered and critiqued. And here's where I get to the most personal part of the video. I am the worst offender of everything I've said so far. I had terrible OCD for 3 years. Everyone I knew about it. You couldn't not meet me and see it in 2 seconds. And I did the stereotypical things like, close the door 25 times or whatever. But in our Zoomer 2025 world, what it most often manifested as was some kind of digital OCD. So the easiest example I can think of is I would have basically, I was a digital hoarder. I could never not watch something, so I would see in my YouTube recommended a bunch of videos I'd want to watch, and I didn't have time to watch them all, so I would just take a screenshot. But that wasn't enough because I needed to make sure that I would watch those videos. So I would take another screenshot and then again and again and again. And I would take the same screenshot 30 times to make sure that I had the screenshot, and then I would watch it. And I would do the same thing with to-dos. I would make sure I would do whatever to do by screenshotting and screenshotting and screenshotting, or opening another tab and typing it into Google and pressing enter, and again and again and again, to the point where my desktop looked like this and my tabs looked like this. And I've been making what I saw YouTuber Westberg call a second brain, where I was outsourcing my learning and knowing and doing things, and I was extirpating them from one another. I would write something down as if to get rid of the responsibility of remembering it and doing it. I would make literally 2,000 notes of things to do, either in the short term, like to-do lists, or in the long term, like business ideas or life goals or long-term philosophy orientations or life outlooks or manifestation declarations or quotes to live by, remember, or a Gary V insight I saw on Instagram. And in doing so, I would erase all need to actually do or live it myself. It's like these studies where people are less likely to fulfill their goals when they tell someone about it, because by telling someone about the goal, you get some of the satisfaction that was supposed to be reserved for completing the goal, even when you haven't made any progress, and that takes away your actual orientation towards completing the goal in real life. To use the words of YouTuber Westenberg, the more my system grew, the more I deferred the work of thought to some future self who would sort and tag and distill and extract the gold. That self never arrived. Someone had commented on that video saying the same thing happened to him with his Watch Later playlist. He deleted it one day 5 years ago and never looked back. But Westenberg is right in saying, I don't want to manage my knowledge, I want to live it. And knowledge isn't a separable part of yourself. It's not a distinct thing from your life or what you do. In a less detrimental way, I would have the same kind of problem with photos. Like, I would keep all these photos and like essays from school in the idea that one day I would go back and read them, and I have never gone back and read them. And I would always be way more focused on saving and cataloging for one potential future day of experiencing and enjoying reading them or looking at those photos than ever actually focusing on and experiencing and enjoying those essays or those photos. Okay, so I've quoted Westberg a few times, so I also just wanted to share what Westberg said on this subject.
2 nights ago, I deleted everything. I deleted every Apple Note I'd synced since 2015, every quote I'd ever highlighted, every to-do list from every productivity system I'd ever borrowed, broken, or bastardized. But over time, my second brain became a mausoleum, a dusty collection of old selves, old interests, old compulsions, piled on top of each other like geological strata. Instead of accelerating my thinking, it began to replace it. I could see how each iteration of myself was trying so earnestly to build a roadmap to something better. But what got me sober, what got me through the first 1, 2, 3 hard years, none of it was in those notes. But they often deliver a kind of abstracted confusion. The more I wrote into my vault, the less I felt. A quote would spark an insight and I'd clip it, tag it, link it, and move on. But the insight was never lived, it was stored. Eventually, I realized I had created an entirely new problem: deferral. The more my system grew, the more I deferred the work of thought to some future self who would sort and tag and distill and extract the gold, and that self never arrived. There is a guilt that accompanies unread books, articles, and blog posts, but there is a special anxiety reserved for unread lists of unread things. My reading list had become a totem of imagined wisdom, a shrine to the person I would be if only I read everything on it. But I never did. When I deleted that list, I lost nothing real. I know what I want to read. I know the shape of my attention. I do not need a 7,000 item database to prove that I have taste or ambition. This mirrors a deeper psychological error, and I am so guilty of it. The belief that by naming a goal, you are closer to achieving it, that by storing a thought, you have understood it, that by filing a fact, you have earned the right to deploy it. And this is productivity as performance. It is a symptom of modern intellectual insecurity. Michelangelo destroyed his sketches. Leonardo left thousands of pages unfinished. The act of deletion is not a failure of record-keeping, it is a reassertion of agency. In design, we speak of subtraction as refinement. A sculptor chips away everything that is not the figure. A musician cuts a line that clutters the melody. In knowledge work, We hoard. We treat accumulation as a virtue. But what if deletion is the truer discipline? I don't think I want a map of everything I've ever read. I want a mind free to read what it needs. I want memory that forgets gracefully. I want ideas that resurface, not because I indexed them, but because they mattered. What does it feel like to start again? Like swimming without clothes, light, naked, a little vulnerable, but cleaner than I felt in years. I write knowing it may disappear. I highlight books knowing the highlights will fade, and I trust that what matters will return, will find its way to the surface. I no longer worship the permanence of text. My new system is, very simply, no system at all. I write what I think, I delete what I don't need, and I don't capture everything. I don't try to. I read what I feel like. I think in conversation, in movement, and in context. I don't build second brains. I inhabit the first brain, my brain.
And my Zoomer Notes app OCD was foreseen, in fact, by Socrates, where he explained his critique of writing, saying, "This discovery of the alphabet will create forgetfulness in the learners' souls, because they will not use their memories. They will trust the external written characters and not remember of themselves. You give your disciples not truth, but only the semblance of truth. They will be heroes of many things and will have learned nothing. They will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing." That's what I fear we're stepping into with AI. As we talked about earlier, knowing and doing things used to be prized the highest. In the Bible, in pre-modern cultures, now we've gotten rid of that veneration for actually knowing things. But imagine how much worse it gets with AI. You won't have to know anything because you can just ask AI, right? But at that point, you're not supposed to know things to know them. You're supposed to know things to understand the world better and act better in it. And AI can never help you do that. Aristotle said the purpose of education was to teach man to love the good and hate the bad. We've separated knowledge into different categories, like the division of labor in capitalism. People think of knowing things different from changing their outlook on life or making different decisions, but they're not supposed to be separable. It's like you hear Richard Dawkins would critique these creationist scientists who would study the records of the universe beginning 14 billion years ago and the way the earth was created and still hold on to a 7,000-year-old earth from creationism. And when asked about it, they would just say they separate those parts of their brain. But truth is truth. It's a modern notion of society separating knowledge into science and philosophy and art. That's why scientists were originally called natural philosophers. And you live in the world and you do things. And human categories can be relevant, but they're not what's real. What's relevant is the thing they're trying to categorize, which is just the reality in the world around you. And therefore, if you know more about the reality around you, you're going to do different things because you know better what you're dealing with and how you should interact with it.
Jean-Jacques Rousseau talks about a lot of similar ideas where not only did major figures like Jesus never write anything down, he specifically came to critique the intellectualism and the rationalism of the Pharisees, the elite Jews of his time who would systematize and intellectualize tithing and giving to the poor and all these things and miss the spirit of the law. And to quote Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Jesus Christ did not entrust his doctrine and ministry to scholars. There is not a single learned or scientific word to be found, lest it be to indicate his contempt for everything of that kind. After the death of Jesus Christ, 12 poor fishermen and artisans undertook to instruct and convert the world. Their method was simple. They preached artlessly but with utter conviction, and of all the miracles with which God honored their faith, the most striking was the saintliness of their lives. Similarly, Sparta and Athens. Athens was renowned for its teaching of rhetoric, its teaching of virtue, its teaching of almost a prototype of the liberal arts, of instructing the whole man, of thinking deeply about things. They were the society that had the tradition of Socrates and Plato, but it was Sparta that from a very early age instilled their values of virtue in their youngest citizens, in teaching them to sacrifice themselves for the state from a very young age. And in the Peloponnesian War, ultimately, it was Sparta, with less resources, that proved successful. For Rousseau, what's important to note is that thinking about virtue is a crutch. The same way how we talked about if you tell somebody about your goal, you're less likely to achieve it because some of the motivational structure, some of the inherent nature of the goal was just released in you telling someone about the goal and getting some of the reward from telling someone about the goal rather than doing it. thinking about virtue, rationalizing about virtue, talking about virtue is something different than virtue itself, and it distracts you from the actual reward system and nature of virtue because you think you're doing virtue when you're actually just talking about it. And this is what Jean-Jacques Rousseau says about philosophers and intellectuals who are focused on this intellectualization of virtue, of arts, of the good, rather than the doing of it, which are different things. He says, talking about intellectuals, when their book was done and published, its content no longer interested them in any way, unless it were to make others adopt it and to defend it in case it were attacked. They drew nothing from it for living their lives, and were not even concerned whether this content was false or true, provided it was not refuted. Meaning they were about writing and proving their ideas propositionally, not discerning the truth of a philosophy and a way to live. And Rousseau talks about this more. He says, the first philosophers earned great renown by teaching men to perform their duties and the principles of virtue. But before long, these precepts had become commonplace, and in order to achieve distinction, because what are philosophers doing in Rousseau's mind? They're not trying to practice virtue, they're trying to gain intellectual points. They're prideful the way all men are prideful. In order to achieve distinction, men had to strike out in opposite directions, such as the origin of the absurd system of many philosophers. Another reason why philosophers' pride is so hidden and they can hide behind saying, oh, I'm just trying to get to the good answer of the good life, is because the timetable for philosophers and their pride is so much longer. As Jonathan B. points out, if you're not in the NBA by 25, you're not going to be in the NBA. Even if you're not a billionaire by 70, you're not going to be a billionaire. But you can live your whole life and die in obscurity and still think that one day you're going to be a renowned intellectual, such is the case with Friedrich Nietzsche. Even a lot of John Locke's works weren't read until after he died. And finally, Rousseau says, even since the learned have begun to appear among us, so Rome's own philosophers themselves said, good men have been in eclipse. Until then, the Romans had been content to practice virtue. All was lost when they began to study it. And we have ceased to see the purpose. What does this mean now? Like, we talk a lot about ideas more than we ever have when we're all going to college and we're thinking about different worldviews, and if the post-World War II Enlightenment liberal democracy is going away, but we're not doing anything about it, and we think thinking about it is actually the point. And we pat ourselves on the back for alleviating poverty and growing living standards, and to some extent that is worthy of praise, but we've lost the spiritual core that goes away when instead of doing things, we start talking about doing things and thinking that we're doing things.
You actually have to know things in order to interact with the world. Like, knowing things is important because empirics is important. Like, Aristotle is one of the greatest minds the human race has ever seen, but he believed through his pure rationality and without any empirics and his deduction skills that women had fewer teeth than men and babies would be healthier if the wind was blowing north when they were born. And if he had actually run some experiments, he could have been maybe disillusioned of those ideas, but he didn't feel the need to. And we are practicing that same hubris today, and thinking we don't need to know or think or do anything because AI will do it for us. But at that point, we've reached what C.S. Lewis called the abolition of man, in which case we're not people anymore. And some people are actually saying that. Like Yuval Harari, he's like, we're not going to be people anymore. We're going to be basically a new species, Homo Deus. And he thinks that's a good thing. Well, whatever. But we do have the real danger of erasing our human nature and entering a brave new world. And one final place this is important is in education, where we need to figure out what we're doing, because as Neil Postman points out,
what are schools for? We can make the trains run on time, but if they don't go where we want them to go, what's the point? For school to make sense, the young, their parents, and their teachers must have a God to serve. There is no surer way to bring an end to schooling than for it to have no end. Without such a transcendent narrative, life has no meaning. Without meaning, learning has no purpose.
I know this girl in college who's basically taken this very nihilistic Darwinian view of AI, where basically she says, if AI takes over and wipes out all the humans, well, that's just the next step in the evolutionary process. At that point, they'll deserve to rule the earth and there'll be no more people. And it's statements like that make me really wonder if we've lost the plot, if we have ceased to see the purpose.
But there is a way out of this. Like that OCD I talked about, I don't have it anymore. Maybe that's another video. But I also used to do that about physical stuff. Like, I used to be very hesitant to throw clothes away, but then I just realized, and this should also be a video, how much time I was wasting and energy of my finite life. It was colossal. That I was just so flummoxed when I really realized the actual cost of being so slow to get rid of personal possessions, including clothes. And so now I went the complete opposite way, and I am now here in Oxford for 6 weeks and literally brought one backpack. This backpack right there. And not only that, I'm about to be going back to college for a semester. And I am going across the country to be there, and I am only bringing that backpack. It's not only saved me so much time and energy, but also a lot of money. I literally never pay for luggage on any airplane, and I spend way less packing time whenever I go to a new place, like basically no packing time. And I don't lose things because there's fewer things to lose. I don't lock my door because what are you going to come in and do, steal my banana? People always say the world's changing. And right now, the world really is. And I can't possibly mean this anymore. What's going to happen in the next few years, and consequently the next century, is really going to depend on what we decide to do with it, what our philosophy is. And just like science never did anything for anybody until it did, and did everything for everybody, philosophy is the same way. And it's about to have its moment. So I hope you're with us and you agree with the philosophy we talked about here and on this channel. But if you don't, let us know below and we'll try to figure out who's right. Because the purpose of debate is not to think about ideas, it's to figure out the right idea. As G.K. Chesterton says, the purpose of an open mind is the purpose of an open mouth, to close it on something solid. But while we do that, and while we look at this brave new world to come, or the brave new world we're going to prevent. Because I have actually seen, and some people commented, I was talking about how our generation is not getting married until 27, 28. Someone commented that in their community that people are getting married really young, like 19, 20, as a rebellion against this sort of social isolation and disconnection that everybody's seeing around them. And maybe we'll see a rise of connection. And of course, tests are becoming more in person now because everybody's just using AI. So we can create a new golden age of human connection and get far away from the abolition of man that is slowly creeping into our lives and grabbing a hold of our minds. But while we look around at the decay around us and decide what to do with it, let us admit, even if in a whisper and only to ourselves, in the hustle of life at breakneck speed, we have ceased to see the purpose.